Okay, guys, it's no secret that the UFC, specifically Dana White, has always been disrespectful to the fighters. This goes way back to the days of Frank Shamrock and Tito Ortiz. I still can't figure out why Tito never fought Dana when he had the chance. But most fighters are not vocal about their hatred for the UFC until after they retire. We see that with all these lawsuits, and then there's this huge antitrust lawsuit that's going on right now. The big shift is that now it's not just the lower level or retired fighters who are expressing their distrust for the UFC, but it's also the superstars. I started to think about this more thoroughly in the recent Jon Jones interview, where Jon said he prefers to do business with Lorenzo Fertitta instead of dealing with Dana. If anyone has been wronged by the UFC, it's Jon Jones. I'll talk about George St-Pierre, Miesha Tate, and Conor McGregor in a minute. But think about what Jon Jones has been through. In his fight against Vitor Belfort, Jon was fighting a man that had super high testosterone levels because of the PEDs he was taking. Jon wasn't even given a heads up, even though the UFC knew about these levels. He was just thrown into the cage with Vitor. In this fight, Vitor was able to catch Jon Jones with a serious armbar. And of course, Jon's not the type of guy that will tap. So he just fought through it, and eventually he did get out of it. But you can see by this picture how deep that armbar is. Anyway, Jon has said, even before this whole Vitor information came out, that his arm has never been the same. Vitor caused some serious damage to it. Then there is this UFC 151 ordeal where Jon was scheduled to fight Dan Henderson. Dan got injured, so Chael Sonnen stepped in on a week's notice. Jon didn't want to take the fight with only a couple days' notice, so the UFC pretty much threw him under the bus. Yes, a company man would have taken the fight, but Jon's coaches advised him not to take the fight. Oh, and by the way, Jon did actually end up fighting Chael, and he smoked him. Jon followed his team's advice because his team wants him to be a legend. Jon's coaches are known for coming up with very intricate game plans, and they didn't want Jon to take the risk of ruining his legacy by taking a fight on such short notice. Jon has only one loss in his career, and that's because of a disqualification. No one has been able to beat Jon Jones to date. We all see how Jon was publicly thrown under the bus. I can see if the UFC wanted to express their anger behind closed doors, but Dana slandered the guy in public. Now this all brings up the recent George St-Pierre remarks. St-Pierre has always been a company man and never badmouthed anyone. However, recently, he expressed his dislike for Dana and said that if it was not for the way Dana treated him, he would most likely have already returned to the UFC and fought a rematch against Johnny Hendricks. I'm not sure if George came out publicly because of Jon's recent statements, or if George is just planning a comeback and trying to negotiate the best deal possible. I guess what George is talking about was a controversial win he had over Johnny Hendricks. After the fight, George said he wanted to take some time off. Apparently this pissed off Dana because he doesn't want a champion to leave with the belt, and also because there was so much money being left on the table with a potential rematch. Anyway, after the fight, Dana tried to prevent George from attending the press conference. Dana told the media that George was not available because he was taken to the hospital. George was backstage and he decided to go to the press conference anyway. This only confirmed what everyone already knew. Dana's a liar. George was also very vocal about PEDs being used in the sport. George wanted to make the fighters take VADA testing. On this instance also, the UFC threw George under the bus. Yet, years later we see how right George was. Look at all the UFC fighters that have been caught using PEDs. So George is one of the biggest MMA stars of all times. You would think Dana White would want to publicly promote his product instead of trying to destroy George's character. Then there is poor Miesha Tate. The whole MMA world knew that if Miesha beat Jessica I, she would be next to fight Ronda for the title. Yes, Miesha had already lost twice to Ronda, but that was the understanding. Then, after Miesha beat Jessica, Dana reaffirmed publicly to the media that Miesha was fighting next for the title. Then this scumbag has Ronda announce that she will be defending her title against Holly Holm. Dana or the UFC did not even have the courtesy to give Miesha a heads up. Miesha had to learn about it like the rest of the world, from the media. In business, rule number 1 should be treat your people right. Miesha was totally screwed over in a humiliating way. Since this incident, Miesha has stated that she no longer trusts the UFC. All future business must be done in writing. No more handshake deals. Dana, before Ronda lost her belt, was stating to the public, taking these little jabs at Miesha, saying that if she is already thinking about retiring, she should just retire. Now I'm sure he's eating those words. She is one of the most famous fighters in the UFC. Everyone knows her. And with Ronda out for who knows how long, the UFC is going to have to use Miesha for her drawing power. Now these are all power players, and they all have came out publicly saying how they distrust the UFC, or more specifically, distrust Dana White. And Dana can't really do anything about it. These are all the stars of the company. Look how the UFC has fired other people because they spoke out about the Reebok deal, or how Dana blocks the media and he won't allow them to ask questions that the public want to know. But he can't just fire or cut these money makers. Then there's Mr. Numbers himself, Conor McGregor. He seems to be dropping little subliminals about his not being compensated correctly. He says things like, "I'm not a company man, I am the company." I think his last pay-per-view event against Chad Mendes did something like 850,000 buys. That's far from a record, but the rumor is Conor made something like 6 or 7 million for the fight. Then Chad made something like 500,000. Think about that. The gate was about 7 million. So basically, the gates used to pay Chad and Conor, and the UFC gets a whole 850,000 pay-per-views to themselves. Compare that to boxing. Pacquiao gets something like a guaranteed 20 or 25 million for doing numbers like that, and Mayweather gets 32 million. I am sure Conor is aware of this and seems to be dropping these little statements because he wants to be paid what he's worth. Now I can see the relationship between Conor and the UFC blowing up sometime in the near future. The UFC is going to have to start paying these guys more, especially with Ronda out of the picture. However, the Notorious has to beat Aldo first. If he can't get past Aldo, it doesn't really matter. But man, with all of this public criticism, not only by journalists, former fighters, but now by power players, I wonder how long it'll continue like this without some major changes or even the UFC sidelining Dana. For some time, the rumors have been that the UFC is trying to cash out or sell the company. But who would buy it now with all this litigation pending and a large antitrust lawsuit, as well as their messed up corporate culture where they just smear the names of their star athletes? I personally hope Dana crawls under a rock somewhere and never reappears. The only reason I watch the UFC is because of the fighters. The UFC needs to pay them right and not have their names slandered by the president. So what do you guys think? Is a major shakeup coming? Let me know your thoughts.